Evening. Thank you for attending the 17th Annual Drawing Discourse Jurors Lecture. My name is Tammy Beldew, and I'm a professor in drawing here at UNC Asheville. 17 years ago, the Drawing Discourse exhibition was created with the intent to demonstrate the continued significance of drawing through both conventional and innovative methods. For the first Drawing Discourse exhibition in 2009, artist and author Deborah Rockman juried pieces from the 564 works submitted by 183 artists. Internationally recognized jurors have followed, bringing both the exhibition and the university recognition. As a result, both the quality and the quantity of entries increase each year. Initially, two major goals were achieved with this exhibition. The first, an exhibition that focuses on contemporary drawing, and the second, to host a visiting juror through artist lectures. Over the years, the ripple effect has extended beyond this initial scope to include cash and purchase awards, exhibition catalogs, student scholarships, and additional programming such as workshops, studio visits, podcasts, and panel discussions. This year, juror Katharine Stout had to select from 1,241 entries, and please hear me say what a feat that is to view that many entries, submitted by 377 artists from 5 countries. Ms. Stout selected a total of 57 pieces for the exhibition that are currently displayed in the S. Tucker Cook Gallery in Owen Hall here on the campus of the University of North Carolina, Asheville. We will have a Q&A at the end of this, so feel free to drop any questions you might have into the chat, and then I can read those at the end. Katharine Stout is a freelance arts consultant, currently curating a solo exhibition of Rose Wiley's works for the Royal Academy of Arts, opening in February 2026. She has worked in various public arts organizations, including as director of Focal Point Gallery in Southend-on-Sea, as deputy director of the Institute of Contemporary Arts London, and as ICA's head of program. Prior to the ICA, Stout was curator of contemporary art at Tate Britain, curating contemporary exhibitions, the Art Now series, Turner Prize, and collections, displays, and acquisitions. In 2001, she co-founded The Drawing Room with Mary Doyle and Kate McFarlane, where she is associate director and serves on the board of Tannery Arts, which provides artists studio space. Stout curated the inaugural Contemporary Arts Commission at the National Maritime Museum as part of a major refurbishment completed in 1999. She has written numerous texts on contemporary art, and her book, Contemporary Drawing, 1960s to Now, was published by the Tate in 2014. I am most pleased to have her join us today for her discussion titled Drawing as an Experimental Medium. Welcome, Katharine Stout.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. We're a little bit ahead of you, so it's quite dark outside. And I'm very sorry that I can't join you later for the opening of the exhibition. Yes, my lecture is called Drawing as an Experimental Medium. And I'm just going to touch upon a few points and look at a few artists to explore that theme. Drawing is an exceptionally flexible tool for artists seeking to find a new language or direction. In my view, the parameters of drawing's remit are set by the flexibility with which artists articulate its role within their practice, rather than how theorists or curators have positioned it within the history of art, revealing a multifaceted and constantly changing discipline. Drawing's heterogeneity has been cited as a reason why it is hard to classify it as a medium, yet perhaps it is this single characteristic that continues to give it such currency. As art historian Ed Kirchmer has pointed out, while as art historian Rosalind Krauss has argued, an artistic medium is not reducible to the material conditions of a technical support. It is nonetheless a set of conventions derived from these conditions. But while the necessary and sufficient conditions required to establish drawing as a logically discrete category remain elusive, drawing, as a noun at least, is cohered by a network of family resemblances, to borrow Wittgenstein's term. Since the 1960s, drawing has been flexing against the boundaries of what defines it as a medium. However, it is useful to define the set of conventions understood within this lecture to fall under the category of drawing. For most artists, drawing continues to be graphite, charcoal, or ink applied to a virgin surface, such as a sheet of paper. Like any, these rules are there to be challenged, and artists use a wide variety of materials to make their marks, such as organic matter or computer technology, on supports that range from ceramic vases to the fabric of a building. Drawing today can take place outside of the gallery space or performed live. What unites all those featured here is that the drawn mark, in whatever format, invariably bears an indexable trace of its making, and this authentic mark remains visible, since even if it erased, it is almost impossible to remove evidence of its trace. This distinguishes drawing from most forms of painting, although watercolour is closely aligned, since layers of paint can be built up and the archaeology of a painting's making kept hidden. This lecture introduces drawing as an experimental art form, in particular its role as a catalyst for change when artists want to disrupt the conventions of the times they are working in. For example, drawing helped challenge the formalist concerns that had come to dominate modernist art theory and practice by the early 1960s, and today it continues to be deployed in an extraordinary range of ways by artists exploring new techniques and subject matter. Arguably, drawing comes into its own when the conventional limits of distinct mediums, in particular painting and sculpture, are being interrogated and transgressed. In doing so, the notion of drawing as secondary to painting and sculpture has been relegated to the past, as it is widely understood now as a primary medium, increasingly visible on the gallery wall rather than hidden in the private realm of an artist's studio. Artists cite the economy and directness of drawing time and time again as its main appeal, although some set out to deliberately thwart other characteristics assigned to it, such as spontaneity. Artists' choice of subject, form, and material today are without limits, and there are arguably increasingly precise reasons why they might select drawing. Often they seek to exploit the full potential of a material, whether ink or pencil, not for its own sake, but in combination with conceptual concerns. A commitment to skillful and labour-intensive methods is no longer seen as mutually exclusive to the drive to articulate a philosophical concept or challenging idea, or as a means to reinvent what a medium is and can be. Over the course of the 20th century, drawing broke from a past in which it had been predominantly cast as a training tool or a functioning record of the world, especially before the invention of photography. Within many art schools, it had been mainly confined to the life drawing class as a means for students to demonstrate their proficiency and technical ability, its application subject to a highly disciplined and regimented programme of academic art instruction from the mid-18th century through to the late 19th. At the turn of the 20th century, an emphasis on form and expression, rather than following the canon of classical realism, emerged within art schools such as the Bauhaus, signalling a burgeoning modern movement. During the more radical changes in British art education, for example, throughout the 20th century, particularly in the post-war era, drawing studies were superseded by other subjects, perhaps because any form of figurative drawing within art school carried at that time echoes of antiquated notions pertaining to the idea of what art and an artist was. By the 1960s, the life room had all but vanished from many art schools in the UK, Although demand for this learning activity has increased in recent years, as well as life drawing becoming an increasingly popular, pleasurable pastime. Just going to share some slides now. A sign of drawing's emancipation from its role as a supporting medium is the way in which artists have used it to enact some of the most transgressive moments in 20th century art. Marcel Duchamp inscribed a moustache on the reproduction of Leonardo's Mona Lisa in 1919 to create A l'âge au cou, challenging the supremacy of the old masters and the revered traditions of oil painting. In 1953, Robert Rauschenberg requested a drawing from one of the most celebrated artists of the day, Willem de Kooning, explaining that he wished to erase it. In framing the resulting monochromatic sheet as his own work of art, Rauschenberg thereby declared the artist's intention, in this case an act of erasure, as being as important as the subjective and direct hand of the artist. American-born British artist Michael Craig Martin provides one of the most succinct explanations as to why drawing continues to have increasing currency, not in spite of its ties with the past, but because of it. He says, "The qualities we have come to value most highly in art in the 20th century have always been present in art, but usually in the past have been characterized by only modest and secondary work, that is, drawings. These characteristics include spontaneity, creative speculation, experimentation, directness, simplicity, abbreviation, expressiveness, immediacy, personal vision, technical diversity, modesty of means, rawness, fragmentation, discontinuity, unfinishedness, and open-endedness. These have always been the characteristics of drawing." As many artists have found, the attractions of drawing is also its pragmatism, the fact that the pencil can be a constant companion and a way to give instant gratification to the impulse to create. As the British artist I'm working with, Rose Wiley, explains, "With drawing, you can do it anywhere. You can do it before going to bed or off the computer. It's more economic. It's simpler to carry around. It's small. It isn't mess like a painting. Painting is physical mess. It gets everywhere. Also, drawing is very immediate, and I've always got pencils." Like many artists on a daily basis, Wiley draws what she sees around her, noticing a change in the seasonal flowers or animal life in her garden, as well as sketching from the screen when watching a film or looking at the internet, sometimes in the moment, sometimes to capture a memory. People are a frequent preoccupation. She might return to the same subject time and time again, capturing different responses and versions that go beyond conventional representation. Wiley feels affinity with the late work of Philip Guston from the 1960s, which saw a shift away from his founding role in the New York School of Abstraction in the 1950s and signaled a return to his earlier figurative interests. At the time, Guston's seemingly abrupt stylistic change received a mixed response, with some critics labelling it crude. It is no coincidence that Guston arrived at this new interest in figuration through an intensive period of drawing between 1967 and 1968, observing, "I'm always excited by the thin line that divides the image from the non-image. What's exciting about an image is that at any given moment, it would take so little to wipe it out completely, to have chaos, to have nothing there. A rearticulation of the line, and whether the line is the subject itself or descriptive, lies at the heart of what has defined drawing over the last 100 years. Two key protagonists of early 20th century art had crucially reimagined the line as the fundamental starting point for a public declaration of new principles of art that turned its back on traditional figuration. In 1921, Paul Klee famously wrote, "From point to line, a line comes into being. The most highly charged line is the most authentic line because it is the most active. In all these examples, the principal and active line develops freely. It goes for a walk, so to speak, aimlessly for the sake of the walk. At the time, Clay was teaching at the Bauhaus School in Weimar, Germany, and was engaged throughout his practice with the relationship between a line that creates a plane or form and its subject. Here, in this quote, he's expressed the joy of allowing the line to be free of descriptive purpose. The same year in Moscow, Alexander Rodchenko wrote a more politically motivated manifesto titled The Line, in keeping with the turbulence and anarchy of the years after the Russian Revolution, arguing that, with the acknowledgement of the importance of the line as the sole element that can be used for construction and creation, colour, factura, and style as ends in themselves were abandoned. Rodchenko's line was the ruled geometric line, since the imprecise, broken line that the hand draws cannot compete with the straight, accurate, ruled line, which gives precision to structure. Together with Noam Garbo and Vladimir Tatlin, who'd renounced the descriptive value of line in their realistic manifesto of 1920, Rodchenko proposed a new era of the utilitarian constructivist line. In contrast, Clay's was a tentative, exploratory line determined by the psyche and hand of the creator. Years later, in 1967, Richard Long trod a linear path by walking up and down in a field in England, photographing it to make a line made by walking. In doing so, he took mark making and the idea of the line beyond the confines of the studio or gallery space and made the body a tool for drawing. Returning to Guston, for subsequent generations, he has become one of the most influential artists to shun abstraction, turning to the medium of drawing, and in particular his love of caricature and satire as a means by which to resolve a critical period of conflict after 30 years as a successful abstract painter. During a 2-year period, he made literally hundreds of drawings in ink and brush or charcoal and paper. He said, "I remember days of doing pure drawings, immediately followed by days of doing the other, drawings of objects. It wasn't a transition in the way it was when one feeling was fading away and a new one had not yet been born. It was two equally powerful impulses at loggerheads." Making austere line drawings that followed the trajectory of his painting practice, Guston would go out at night, in his words, to the studio to do drawings of objects, books, shoes, buildings, hands. Feeling relief and the strong need to cope with tangible things, I would denounce the pure drawings as too thin and exposed. Too much art, not enough nourishment, and as an impossible direction with no future. By 1968, living in the isolated town of Woodstock, watching the media reports of events such as the demonstration against the war in Vietnam and the riots in Chicago, Guston was driven to create highly charged vocabulary of forms in which he could represent his own anxiety over the political events and how American society was responding to them. Disembodied body parts such as a hand, a naked eye, a shoe or boot, a smoking head and cartoonish characters came to animate and inhabit his work. The hooded people, now instantly recognizable as iconic Guston images, in fact recall one of his earliest paintings, The Conspirators, circa 1930. Through these recurrent pared-down motifs, he sought to make sense of events such as the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which were radically altering American society at that time. Perhaps it's no coincidence that drawing came to the fore in the 1960s, at a time when the formal purism for which Clement Greenberg argued as essential to the ongoing quality of modernist art was seen to be driving it into a cul-de-sac. In various guises, drawing offered alternative routes for experimentation, partly due to its association with so-called low art forms, such as comics, advertising, graphic art, and caricature, as well as its usage within related fields, for example, architecture and mathematical or systems analysis. Through adopting styles and techniques from these areas, artists were able to forge new territory for their art. By the late 1960s, just like Guston, they'd become increasingly motivated by a wish to let the world in, rather than continue to develop art that existed within a separate realm. Drawing allowed a means of strengthening the gene pool of art by contaminating it. Drawing continues to be adaptable for application and at the forefront of new technologies, for example, in the digital realm and AI. For many, Mel Bochner's 1966 exhibition, Working Drawings and Other Visible Things on Paper, Not Meant to be Viewed as Art, signalled the beginning of the conceptual art movement. Bochner asked artists, scientists, architects, and mathematicians to submit a working drawing, which he termed as the site of private speculations, a snapshot of the mind at work. Not made for public display and often indecipherable, it exists below the minimum requirements of a work of art, thereby introducing notions of reproduction and irrelevance of authenticity into art practice and exhibition making. By including photocopies of material ranging from illegible jottings to Donald Judd's bill for the fabrication of a sculpture, a page from Scientific America, as well as works on paper by other professionals, Bochner presented the idea that the thinking behind a work was just as significant as the final work of art itself, thus questioning the insistence on the finished object as the artwork, not least since he viewed the exhibition as his own work. Of significance also was Bochner's proposition that drawing could be a rational and often preconceived mode of articulating ideas and visual motifs, instead of the expressive mark-making with which it had been previously strongly associated. In the catalogue of the exhibition, The Stage of Drawing, Gesture and Act, selected by artist Avis Newman and shown at Tate Liverpool and the Drawing Centre, New York, in 2003, contemporary art theorist Michael Newman articulates this shift with reference to the work of Sol LeWitt, who was a peer and close friend of Bochner. Newman writes, "Drawing continues to occupy an in-between, between gesture and concept, or between mark and design. Until the 1960s, it was possible to maintain a synthesis between the two through the idea of expressive subjectivity. When the subject is no longer able to function as a synthesizing term, the duality of drawing becomes visible. It does so in an exemplary way in the drawings of Sol LeWitt, notably in the wall drawings, where the transparency of the instruction that generates the configuration of lines, usually executed by an assistant, gives rise to lines inflected by the irregularities of the surface and the contingencies of the process of execution." Bochner's foregrounding of the conceptualization of a work of art in this exhibition correlates strongly with the well-charted belief that drawing is the medium most closely aligned with the genesis and materialization of thought. In 1969, he wrote a short text titled "Anyone Can Learn to Draw," in which he identified three principal modes of drawing: working, diagrammatic, and finish. For Bochner, the first, as the residue of thought, was the most important, with finished drawings the least. He said, finished drawings don't really have to be talked about in terms of drawing at all, but rather must be related back to the artist's practice as a whole. This aligns with the beliefs of an artist and one of the first art theorists, Giorgio Vasari, whose writing about drawing, first published in 1568, continues to have an extraordinary hold over perceptions of the medium. Vasari described disegno in his introduction to the second edition of Lives of Artists as the parent of our three arts, architecture, sculpture, and painting, having its origin in the intellect, draws out from many single things a general judgment. It is like a form or idea of all the objects in nature. From this knowledge, there arise a certain conception and judgment, so that there is formed in the mind that which afterwards, when expressed by the hands, is called design. In this context, disegno, which translates as both drawing and design, was understood not just as a physical activity, but as a visible expression and declaration of our inner conception and of that which others have imagined and given form to in their idea. Consequently, this Italian word for drawing came to have a complex meaning within art history, relating both to the intellectual capacity to conceive a drawing and the technical ability to execute the drawing and therefore give the idea form. The dual opportunity that drawing offers to convey both an idea and technical accomplishment is why over the last half century it has continued to be perhaps the most pluralist medium. Vasari was writing soon after the High Renaissance, when artists were acclaimed for their pursuit of realism, especially of the human body. By the 20th century and the arrival of modernism, this was not such a priority, as artists sought to interpret the world around them. Both Guston and Wiley share an aversion to representational art as waxworks, for which Wiley cites Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who counsels against art as nothing more than an imitation of nature, stating, "Why are such simulations of nature, as waxworks figures of men and women, so disagreeable?" Wiley, like Guston before her, and as Coleridge before both of them, believes that a transformation needs to take place in the process of making art, which Coleridge sets out in his 1818 treatise on poesy or art. He writes, "It is sufficient that philosophically we understand that in all imitation, two elements must coexist, and not only coexist, but must be perceived as coexisting. These constituent elements were likeness and unlikeness, or sameness and difference, and in all genuine creations of art, there must be a union of these disparates." Before the invention of photography, drawing was regarded as the most direct means to offer a realistic visual description of our environment, a convenient and practical tool for artists to record what they saw. Throughout the 20th century, particularly in the Western world, the realistic rendition of subjects from life as motivation for artists became increasingly viewed as irrelevant. In this Second World War era, whether or not artistic modes of expression were engaged with realism became entwined with political ideology. American expressionist art in the 1950s was officially promoted as linked to democratic values of freedom of speech and expression, in direct challenge to the country's Cold War enemies. Whilst artists under communist rule were obliged to practice state-regulated forms of socialist realism, introduced into the Soviet Union by Stalin in the 1930s, in fact a reversal of Rodchenko's revolutionary rejection of figuration, and aggressively enforced even into the 1980s. In the second half of the 20th century in China, particularly during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, the only acceptable forms of art were those that promoted party policy and conformed to a social realist style. By the 1960s in the United States and across Europe, artists who wished to engage with realistic figuration to represent the external world rather than the subjective self tended to arrive at means other than the direct act of drawing from life. Instead, the observational gaze was mediated through the camera lens. Some artists, as we have seen with Guston, alongside Andy Warhol or Roy Lichtenstein, depicted the changing world around them through the strategic adoption of figurative styles from outside the realm of fine art, such as caricature, comics, or advertising. On the opposite coast of America, particularly in Los Angeles, artists such as Ed Ruscha and Via Salmons sought to represent the world through new forms of realism that were less concerned with packaging and consumer objects than their pop art cousins on the East Coast. Ruscha and Salmons, for whom drawing has been a constant and critical to their output, saw the work of Jasper Johns as a vital catalyst in rethinking what representation could be. Ruscha describes seeing a painting of a target by Jasper Johns as an atomic bomb in his training, just as it was pivotal for many of their peers and countless artists since. John's seminal paintings of flags, numbers, maps, and targets revealed that a work could simultaneously exist as a representational image and an autonomous flat material object. Yet it is worth noting that even John Ruskin, the influential 19th century artist, art critic, and patron, who zealously promoted the practice of drawing from nature, was aware that the mimetic act of representing nature was only ever an abstract of natural facts. This view echoes the classical theory of mimesis proposed by Plato that maintained art was only ever an inferior imitation of nature. The idea of mimicry, or copying after reality, has informed the historical discourse around mimesis by philosophers and art theorists, and it is notable that the repeated treatment of a familiar subject is the way in which many artists have engaged with representation. Johns first depicted his themes in paint, and his drawings are often made after a painting rather than as preparatory sketches to explore a limited lexicon of motives. He commented, "Once something is established in my mind as an image, I go to great lengths to reproduce it by whatever means." And he often explored the potential of an image through the material differences of painting, drawing, and printmaking. In his drawings, he makes systematic marks with a pencil so that a familiar image is further modified, causing the eye to see the indexical, almost abstract monochromatic mark making at the same time as it recognizes the subject represented. Johns maintained that an ambivalent stance to his subject matter, declaring that the idea of a flag came to him in a dream. Despite the fact that subjects such as the American flag, targets, and maps now seem clearly loaded with meaning when set against the political turbulence of 1950s America, he stated, "To me, they seemed preformed, conventional, depersonalized, factual exterior elements." Similarly, Ruscha and Salmons have suggested that their themes are as much vehicles for the material exploration of an image as a response to their Californian locality, although Ruscha in particular pictures LA as the ultimate city for media, commerce, and popular culture. The choice of subject matter for both is nearly always mediated via photography, either found or authored. Ruscha comments, "A photograph shows me how a subject would look flat, so I didn't have to make all those adjustments from nature. Other artists translate the 3 dimensions of the real world into a 2-dimensional image. The photograph did that for me." His drawings and painting, made after the photographic images of apartment buildings, gasoline stations, and his now iconic depiction of the 20th Century Fox logo, have a cool, detached quality that is perhaps more characteristic of their source, or indeed graphic design, in which Ruscha originally trained. The flatness and physicality of the image is emphasized in the drawings by the way in which Ruscha works the pigment into the paper so that no individual marks are visible. By the 1960s, Ruscha turned his attention from the LA urban environment to depicting words as 3-dimensional objects, revealing how for him language resonates with a palpable presence. "Words have temperatures to me. When they reach a certain point and become hot words, then they appeal to me." He also started using gunpowder instead of traditional graphite or charcoal, finding its liquid fluidity easier to manipulate. By rubbing the pigment into the paper with cotton wool, he achieved the smooth, luminous effect he wanted. He went on to use the same technique with pastels to introduce colour. A few years later, his interest in the exploitation of matter extended into a series of abstract drawings titled Stains, in which he experimented with organic substances that included Coca-Cola, as seen here, red salmon roe, bolognese sauce, raw egg, squid in ink, chocolate syrup, caviar, baked beans, chutney, daffodils, tulips, and axle grease. Yet, as Cornelia Butler has described, these formal investigations were conducted in parallel to his concern with premeditated ideas. It seems that the equally committed dialectical investigations of photographically based conceptualism and pure material exploration that dominate Rucha's work around 1970 collide in interesting ways at this early point in his career. In the artist's own words, I started looking at ideas as though they were stains. Salmons has constantly been fascinated by the way in which certain images, such as night skies, oceans, and deserts, can operate both as illusionary scenes of apparent infinite depth and remain resolutely flat on the surface of the paper. The material, she says, the material, charcoal, and pencil and paper are bigger players in the night sky pieces. The work is much more abstract, even though your mind says this is a deeper space. I think the uniform nature of the graphite sitting on the surface keeps you engaged in the flat place. There really is no depth to it. Although her stated interest in these found images is in how they can be manipulated in this way, the violence of her earlier subject matter during the 1960s, such as military aeroplanes and smoking guns, hints at her extraordinary childhood. Her family lived for some years on the run in Latvia during the war before escaping to the US. Although the more neutral later themes can be understood on one level as a desire to paint and draw what she could see in the immediate environment of her LA studio, which also came to encompass the expansive landscape that typifies California. Salmons went on to concentrate exclusively on drawing for a sustained period during the 1970s, eschewing the discipline of painting in which she had trained because she was unsatisfied with the conventional space it offered. She put this shift in focus down to, again a quote, realization that the image and the subject could unify, and the way to do it was through pencil. She spent the next 15 years exploring the simple materiality of graphite and charcoal and paper to create some of her most iconic works. Salmons has returned time and time again to the same images, which recently also include spider webs and ocean planes, since they ultimately offer a familiar vehicle for interrogating the subtle differences in pencil, in her own mood, and in her handling of space. What holds the viewer's gaze is how Salmon's images of subliminal views invoke infinite depth and yet constantly remind the eye of their inescapable flatness, being nothing more than the uniform monochromatic graphite sitting on the surface of paper. Her work has an intensity that derives both from the laborious technique of laying down the graphite bit by bit. One drawing can take up to a year, and the emotional resonance of the sublime subject matter. As the artist herself comments on the work, when you look at them, don't you want to come up for breath? These are just some of the many artists who have chosen drawing to create new vocabulary and styles for their time. We have seen drawing as a line made by walking, a pencil taken for a walk, a representation of a national flag, as political satire, and as inventory of artists' ideas. And these are but a fraction of the ways in which artists have reinvented what drawing can be over the last 100 years. through negotiating the shifting and circular priorities between abstraction and forms of figuration in different eras. Today, there is no one dominant style or motif, which is exhilarating and challenging for artists. The annual Discourse exhibition, which this lecture accompanies, shows how drawing remains perhaps the most adaptive tool for artists wishing to represent themselves, the world they see and experience, or simply express themselves in the abstract. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of claps there. That's excellent. Questions, put those in the chat, or I can try to see you. And I can maybe unmute you. We'll see. See if I'm good at that. You can raise a hand if anyone has questions. Don't be bashful. Well, I think you just declared everything that resolute that it begs no questions. Okay, wait, I've got some. This is from artist Matt McHugh, who I believe was in the exhibition last year. It says, "Thank you. Where do you see drawing going in the future?"
I mean, you tell me. I gather there are a lot of artists on this call, and I think, as I said at the beginning, I think it really is how artists choose to use drawing in all its forms. There's many other ways in which I could have discussed drawing in a three-dimension. Drawing now is being used as with digital technologies. So perhaps that's a direction. But I think, the use of drawing and artists are always contrary as well. So perhaps our increasing digital sort of worlds that we live in means that artists also want to come back to the material of drawing and the sort of physicality that drawing offers. And I think, again, it gave me such pleasure to look through the drawings for the challenge of selecting for this exhibition, to see that, just how drawing is thriving, that there are so many different ways of using it, and just how individual each practice can be.
Thank you. I have another artist here saying, "Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. Can you talk about England being a hub of drawing innovation today?"
Well, I can talk a little bit about the drawing room, which I co-founded in when was it? We're 20 years next year. So yeah, we've been going for a couple of decades. And we set up because there was nothing like it in England at that time, or even in Europe. There was, of course, a drawing centre that we looked towards for inspiration. But we also really noticed at that time, coming out of the sort of late 90s, how artists were increasingly using drawing. It was a time of, when Raymond Pettibon was really coming to the fore, Marcel Zama. There were so many artists whose work was being increasingly visible in museums, in shows. Michael Craig Martin, who I've mentioned, many artists, and we just felt that it would be important to have a venue that really gave a home for that practice, but also to explore the expanded field of drawing. So we set out to represent drawing in all its forms, partly to challenge what people thought of drawings, but ultimately to represent what artists were making. We also have a study. So we have the only dedicated library for drawing in Europe. And we often partner with different universities and colleges or sort of academic institutions on symposia and events. And in a way, again, it's just the constant inventiveness in which artists are using drawing that continues to kind of drive the drawing room's practice and particularly exhibition program. And then, of course, it is also very accessible because, from the earliest age, a child picks up a pencil to express themselves. And that is a route into language as well as art. So I think drawing does have that immediacy and appeal that actually, I think makes it very accessible to a wider public as well. And that's very important to us at the drawing room in the work that we do, that we feel like we're there for the community as well as to our artist community.
Thank you for that. One of the artists that is exhibiting with us this year says, "Thank you." This is from Nancy Ivanhoe. "Thank you. Enjoyed your lecture. Which artist said drawing is pencil taking a walk?"
So Paul Klee,
Yeah.
so he was an artist. Trying to remember if he was Swiss, but I was very lucky to visit his museum in Bern this year because Rose Wiley, the artist who I'm working with at the Royal Academy, had an exhibition there, and they have a dedicated museum with a kinder museum actually. So half of the museum is a museum just for children, and then half is devoted to his archive and collection, and then a temporary exhibition space. And if you don't know his work, it is, wonderful. And he was very influential as a teacher, but also very much at that time breaking down the boundaries between figuration, abstraction, which is a kind of dance that has gone on as I sort of tried to describe a little throughout the 20th century. But he was very influential at that time in the 1920s and the 30s to sort of, kind of rethink and also spoke very eloquently about the kind of theories behind that.
Thank you.
If y'all need to ask questions to me.
Tammy, I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Can you tell us what theme you've devised as a jurist for this show that we're about to see?
No theme as such. I did have some criteria when I was trying to decide. I'm just looking for the exact wording, but really I was looking for kind of inventiveness and originality in concept and approach. I was looking for the sort of technical accomplishment in how that idea or concept was realized. And I was looking to really reveal the amazing variety that I could see throughout the submissions. And that's what I found really exciting, is that, again, just as I've tried to talk about this evening, that drawing can take so many forms, take you into so many different worlds, so many different moods, and is a very expressive medium to, I think, explore ideas as well. So some very inventive ways in which the artists were trying to explore their own emotions or emotional state or state of the world, and doing so through different modes of representation. So those were the kind of three criteria that I had. And then within that, tried to, select what I thought were, I guess, the most exemplary examples that I could see throughout the submission.
Thank you. We've got another question in the chat from artist and educator Leah Lietzen. "The idea of the drawing as a stain, I love, and all the elements involved in that is a bit of a narrative that isn't visual, but is part of the title or subtext. More thoughts on this?"
Yeah, I think what you mean is, so, that, I mean, it's kind of sort of not fun, but it's also once you know that that stain is Coca-Cola or a bolognese sauce or a kind of, it sort of takes you from, this is me thinking out loud, but with that particular series of Ed Risher's work, so you see it's something completely abstract, but then when you see the title of the material, it takes you straight back into the real world, and you can kind of picture that real kind of physical substance that he's made the work from. And I think that play is really interesting. I think that's what you're referring to, that kind of narrative, that knowing what that material that is a very everyday material that he might have found, but then what you're looking at is actually could be something quite beautiful but completely abstract, that until you're given that sort of bit of knowledge as to what it is, you're just looking at it as a completely sort of abstract form of expression. So yes, it is fascinating, and I think with Ed Risher's work, there's a lot of humour in it. There's a lot of wry humour, and I think with the Stain series that's particularly there, and that's what makes it very enjoyable, as you say.
Excellent. Thank you so much for elaborating more on that. We have time for one more question, if anyone has one. And we've got a live stream happening in a room here on campus, so you can unmute if you would like. If there was somebody that makes it hard to type into the chat, you feel free to ask another question from there.
Hi, Catherine. How's it going?
It's
Um,
good, thank you.
good. I was curious. For me, drawing seems to live in this kind of unfinished state. Other mediums, when I work in them, they seem to tell me when a work is complete. But drawing always seems to sort of invite me back in, even when I think I'm finished. I'm drawn back. Is there something you could touch on that maybe is our interest in drawing, that it sort of lives in this different kind of state of being finished or never feeling like it's ever the journey isn't over, that I think makes drawing really compelling. I was just curious.
I mean, I suppose, there is a sense that drawing is the closest to the sort of idea of thought, that kind of immediacy that it has. I mean, it's a long time since I've been a practitioner myself, but that sort of very directness, the kind of qualities that I read out, that Michael Craig Martin listed, the spontaneity, the rawness of drawing, and I think it's kind of connection with writing as well, the idea that it feels very immediate and connected to both thought and expression. Perhaps that's what you're touching upon, that which our thoughts are never ending, and the sort of possibilities of that, or same with our emotions. So maybe that is a little bit the sense that drawing gives. And I quite like also Rose Wiley's quote about talking about how drawing just always feels active. It's something you can always do, rather than, I guess, painting or sculpture, you need to sort of set it up. It's something you sort of maybe have to prepare, but drawing can be, I mean, depending on what kind of drawing you do, it can be something that's quite constant as well. It's very immediate and doesn't necessarily have a beginning or end. But I think there are, as I try to illustrate, there are lots of different kinds of drawing. Via Selman's drawing, although they might take a year, there's a definite kind of sense of them being a kind of finished piece, a very sort of worked piece, as it were. Whereas other drawings are much more sort of expressive and spontaneous. So I think, again, drawing is very pluralist. You can't, and that's what's so fascinating. You can't sort of prescribe it the same characteristics. It's really down to how different artists and different people use it. But I think that sense of, maybe what you're describing is its sense of possibility as well.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. That was amazing. An amazing talk.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And so with that, thank you very much for being here with us this evening. Thank you to everyone that has attended as well. For those of you who are physically here with us, please enjoy the exhibition opening that opens now in the S. Tucker Cook Gallery located in Owen Hall. And as always, exhibitions may be viewed online on our departmental website, and the recording of this lecture will be posted there as well. And while you're there, don't hesitate to go back and look at previous iterations of the exhibition. I think when you start looking through the years, you see that the word discourse is really well defined. And thank you, Katharine, again. It's been such an honor.
The pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.